exciting to, after 2 years, bring History Cafe back in person. So thank you. We hope that we can soon bring the cafe part back, but for safety reasons today, we're keeping it closed. But we're so happy to see you in person, so thank you for coming. My name is Rachel Spence at MOHAI. For a visual description, I'm a white woman with red curly hair. I'm wearing a gray dress and a blue scarf with birds on it. And we're so happy you're here. History Cafe is one of my favorite programs we do here at MOHAI. It is a long-term partnership with HistoryLink. Jennifer, I don't know if you want to wave. Our partners at HistoryLink, and it's the third Wednesday of every month. And we have been having it throughout the pandemic, and so glad to now have it back in person. I'll say this at the end too, but just so you know, next month's going to be a little different because we're going to be doing a walking tour. So all sorts of changes happening here this spring. Also, I think you all saw on your way in, but our store is open, and on your way out, you can check that out as well. And finally, we're excited to announce that we have both ASL Interpretation and CART captioning. And this is through generous support from the Institute of Museum and Library Services to help our programs be more accessible. So thank you. We also are live streaming tonight, so hello to all of you who might be watching us via Facebook. We're trying to increase our hybrid offerings so that we can keep that digital audience that we built during the pandemic while also being able to serve those of you who can come in person. Before we begin the program, I want to acknowledge that here at MOHAI, we are on the historic and contemporary lands of the Duwamish, Suquamish, Muckleshoot, and all Coast Salish people. Historically, Native communities were forcibly removed from the city, but today we honor their continued endurance with deep respect and gratitude for their unbroken stewardship of this place. We will continue to dive more deeply into this history in our other offerings, but beyond that, beyond the statement, we encourage you to do a little research to learn more about whose land you're on, and this can be done by looking up the websites of local tribes. If you're joining us online and you're not in the Seattle area, I recommend going to nativeland.ca to figure out whose land you're on. And now I'm going to introduce our wonderful speaker for the evening, past MOHAI alum actually, Felix Bennell, who is a host and historian for KIRO News Radio and the producer-host of the Resident Historian podcast. He's a freelance producer of Emmy-nominated history videos for the Seattle Channel and was deputy director of the Museum of History and Industry from 1999 to 2006. So thank you so much for coming back, Felix, and sharing your knowledge with us.
All right, thank you, Rachel. Can everybody hear me okay, even through this mask? Very good, okay. Yeah, it is nice to be back. I had a wonderful time working at MOHAI, what's that, almost 16 years ago now? So I'm here tonight to talk about radio, and I love radio, and I assume that everyone in the audience here also loves radio just as much as I do. I don't think it's going too far to say that I think radio is superior to television. One thing I noticed during the pandemic, television became more like radio during the pandemic. And what I mean by that is, traditionally, in news radio or any radio station, you had access to any guest, any live guest, anywhere in the world who was near a telephone. You could call that person, you could put them on, and you could have them ask them questions, have them tell you what they were seeing, if it was some international event or something happy or something sad. And the audio quality didn't really matter because it was radio, and it could be a scratchy phone, and people understood what you were doing because you could hear that voice. With Zoom and FaceTime and all these other video platforms that were available, and television stations forced to work with skeleton crews and different approaches to broadcasting, all of a sudden, the whole notion of everyone having a telephone being a guest now became anyone who had a smartphone or a laptop could also be a guest on your television program. And so I think that says a lot about the enduring power of radio, that television became more like radio when faced with a crisis and faced with big challenges about delivering the content. So now, what I'll be talking about is a non-comprehensive history of radio in Washington State. We'll hit some of the big highlights from the very earliest commercial broadcasts back in the 1920s, and we'll see how far we get up into probably the 1960s, maybe even the 1990s, depending how quickly I speak or how much time I spend lingering on one particular part of the story. I'm in my early 50s. I think I'm one of the last generations who grew up on pure radio, where there wasn't any other appliance that was delivering audio. There weren't smartphones, of course, and there weren't laptops. And radios just were constant companions in your car, or in your transistor you carried with you, or the nice hi-fi set in the living room. And my parents are now both are deceased. They were born in the 1920s in Europe. My dad used to tell me about when he remembered hearing about Lindbergh landing in Paris. I think it was 1927. He was 5. He heard that on the radio in his native Poland. He heard about that. And my mom used to talk about gathering with her family around the radio in London, where they listened to BBC coverage of Dunkirk and the evacuation that was going on to get British soldiers off the beaches in France and back over to the UK. And my father, in his native Poland, after the Nazis invaded, he ended up joining the underground army, the organized resistance to Soviets and the Nazis. And he used to tell the story about how one morning later in the war, probably 1944, and he and his colleagues, or fellow underground army soldiers, captured a German weather station, something related to Luftwaffe, something related to aviation, where there were soldiers stationed out in the woods. And my father and his, his fellow soldiers captured the station and captured this incredible German radio. And they took it back to where their camp was, somewhere in the woods there in northeastern Poland. And my dad was fiddling with it, and he tuned in the BBC, Polish service. Because the BBC in London had figured out early in the war that if they could send beam news in the native language into European countries, there was almost nothing you could do to stop that information getting to the people who otherwise were cut off from information. And so as they're fiddling with that radio, they get news that the Allied invasion has begun. It's D-Day. It's June 6, 1944. And so my father, sitting in the woods, hundreds of miles from where he grew up, I don't know, probably 1,000 miles from London, maybe. Not sure the actual distance. They're getting news. They're getting hope. They're getting the sense that it's not the end of the beginning or the beginning of the end or whatever, but the Allied invasion of Europe, the liberation of Europe is underway. And that's just, I remember hearing that story when I was a little kid, and I understood how cool that was as I got older, the fact that you could be hundreds of miles away from something, or thousands of miles away, and be provided with information in a timely way, someone live reading a bulletin, and you're hearing it as if through magic. I still think that's pretty magical. Of course, if you know your Polish history, you know that the Allied invasion didn't quite get as far as Poland, and Poland got a pretty raw deal after World War II, being part of the Soviet bloc. But for a while there was hope provided through that radio. So that's why I love radio. It's been a fixture in my life. It's so immediate. It's so cheap to produce good quality radio if you know what you're doing. You don't need video cameras. You don't need streaming technology. It's all about human voice. It's like people sitting around a campfire telling a story. And it's about talking in a way and telling things in a compelling enough way that people want to eavesdrop. And I think that's brilliant. One more observation about radio before I get into the history. I don't know, who's familiar with the program Car Talk that was on public radio for a long time out of Boston? One of the two brothers, I think it's Click or Clack, passed away probably 10 years ago. But until very recently, they were still playing reruns of that show on a lot of public radio stations, and it's a podcast now. And for me, Car Talk isn't about cars. I don't listen to that. I love cars, and I love hearing about cars. But I'm not listening because I want to know about someone's 81 Chevette that has a problem with its transmission. What that show is about for me, it's about two intelligent brothers, Tom and Ray Magliozzi. I think Tom's the one who's passed away. The two of them loving each other. I mean, it's their. I tune in to hear them talk to each other. and make fun of each other and tell jokes and share memories about growing up in Boston and all that sort of thing. I couldn't care less about the content, but it's the relationships. And that's the best radio that I've ever listened to, that I remember now to this day, hearing live when something was happening, is when I have some kind of relationship with the voice I'm hearing because I've been listening to it for a long time, and or the people on the air together obviously love each other or care about each other and are doing something they love and sharing the information. That's the magical part of radio. And it's natural to eavesdrop on that. Like, unlike television, or unlike this situation here where I'm standing up at a podium and talking to you and you're sitting there all politely listening to me, radio is just a conversation, when at its best. All right, next slide, please. I like saying that. That's fun. It's like being in college. So I started semi-seriously studying Pacific Northwest radio history probably about 20 years ago. And it wasn't too long after reading a lot of books about East Coast radio and doing a lot of newspaper research and other research about radio here on the West Coast and Washington in particular, it started to occur to me that radio there's something different about it in the Northwest. People seem to love radio more. It seemed to play a bigger role in how people communicated. It seemed to play a bigger role in how pop culture was spread, how people loved their sports teams, how people heard about what was going on. And this is all anecdotal. I didn't have any quantifiable thing I could point to and say, look, radio was more important here in the West Coast. But then one day, I found an old book from 1938 called Advertising, Radio as an Advertising Medium by Warren Dygert. One of these sort of, I don't think it was a college textbook. I think it was just a book about the radio industry. And it had a map in it. Next slide, please. Here finally was proof that radio was more important, was more beloved on the West Coast. Take a minute to explain what this diagram is here. Okay, it's a map that says radio ownership by geographic divisions of USA. Now these geographic divisions don't exactly correlate with geographic divisions we would use in 2022, but they should be roughly familiar. And what is shown in each block there in the big percentage number is the percentage of households in that region that own at least one radio. You'll see, like in what they call the East-South Central, not the East Coast, but the southern part of the United States, east of Texas, west of Florida, 60% of households have at least one radio. Even up in the populated Northeast, around the Boston, New York area, 92% of homes have at least one radio. If you get out to the West Coast, 95% of homes have at least one radio. That's the highest rate anywhere in the country by 3 percentage points. In terms of total number of radios, there's far more radios in the densely populated parts of the Northeast than there are along the West Coast, right? We get the difference between ratios and total numbers, right? But there's just something about the fact that the Pacific Coast loves their radios. And I've never been able to find the answer of why. Does anyone have any guesses about why that might be?
Less dense?
I think that's part of it. I don't think there's one single reason that someone said less dense. I think it's a combination of things. I think this is 1938. It's not the data's from 1937, so it's not the depths of the Great Depression, but the times are still pretty tough in 1937. We haven't had a huge boost in spending to put people back to work in munitions factories and other stuff to prepare for World War II. During the Depression, the West Coast was hit hard, as other parts of the country were. But I think we didn't have as far to fall in terms of the actual direct impact. There wasn't as much heavy industry on the Pacific Coast as there was in, say, the central Midwest or the Northeast, where factories were shut down and unemployment rates were very high. Here, people already were living fairly frugally. Times weren't tough. We didn't fall as far and as hard. Someone, when I gave this presentation earlier, guessed about the availability of cheap public power. I think that could be part of it. But I think also just the fact that the population is not as dense as other parts of the country. Entertainment choices, there's fewer entertainment choices. If you have to drive 50 miles to a movie theater, you're more likely to spend money to buy a radio and listen to radio dramas every night than drive into town. Not that you don't ever drive into town, but I still have never been able to find the actual reason for this. But it was heartwarming to know there was data that supported the theory that radio was just more important, more beloved here in the West Coast. All right, now let's go to the next slide, please. Just look at this very quickly. This gives you an idea of the density of population in the United States. These are radio stations that were affiliates of the Columbia Broadcasting System, or CBS. Now, so you see there's parts of the country, I think Wyoming, there's not a single CBS affiliate in 1939 when this map was prepared. Now, that doesn't mean there were no radio stations in Wyoming. There were plenty of radio stations, there wasn't a CBS affiliate. What this indicates is national advertisers wanted to reach people where the population was most dense, and that's of course the East Coast, the Midwest, and parts of the West Coast, including Seattle and Portland, and then Northern California and Southern California. Just a different way of slicing up some of that same data about radio ownership, and then this is network affiliation, and how big corporations and big advertisers could reach a national audience. Next slide, please. Now, our own sort of Marconi type figure here in the Northwest is Vincent Kraft, in my mind. Now, when Marconi was inventing radio or popularizing radio in the 1890s, he was talking about, there wasn't human voices being sent over the airwaves. It was Morse code being sent, a series of dots and dashes to communicate by code. It wasn't until around 1906 that the human voice could be transmitted over the airwaves. And so in 1909, Vincent Kraft, who's a young engineer living in Seattle, puts up a 100-foot antenna at his family's home there in the University District. And he's experimenting with all sorts of amateur radio, talking to people by Morse code around the world. And it's Vincent Kraft who in 1918, next slide please, develops one of Seattle's first radio stations and one of the first radio stations in Washington State to be licensed by the federal government, and which eventually becomes KJR. This is the house in Seattle's Ravenna neighborhood where Vincent Kraft lived. He would be on the air, an hour or two each night playing records. People would listen to him on radios they'd made themselves, very simple radios. It was difficult. You couldn't just go to the department store yet and buy a radio. But I found this picture on Google Maps, and I thought, oh, there's Vincent Kraft's house. There's where radio broadcasting was born in Seattle. Let's go look at it in person. Next slide, please. So Vincent Kraft's house is no longer there. One of the tricks of radio history is that the product, the item that we're talking about, is invisible. It's just sound. And very little of it was recorded because the technology wasn't there to easily record radio broadcasting until well into the 1930s or even the 1940s. And so when a landmark like Vincent Kraft's house is no longer there, we all lose a little bit of something. I always thought it would be wonderful to have some kind of series of historic markers marking places where radio broadcasting events happened, just simply because it is such an invisible thing that we're talking about. Now, next slide, please. Now, radio really sort of becomes a thing and comes of age as something that people other than just radio enthusiasts or other than just people who can build their own gear, it becomes a thing. And around the summer of 1921, there was a boxing match between Jack Dempsey and Georges Carpentier in Hoboken, New Jersey. And there was a national broadcast of that fight, including here in Seattle. But when I say national broadcast now, we would mean someone sitting ringside or in a press box, watching what was going on and describing it to you, and then that voice being sent out over a series of antennas and wires to antennas all over the country, and everyone tuning in at the same time. That's not what happened in 1921. For that Dempsey-Carpentier fight, there was somebody sitting ringside, but they were sending a telegraph description of what was going on. And then radio broadcasters in various cities were getting that feed, getting that information by telegraph about blow by blow, literally blow by blow, what was going on. And then they were describing it to their local audience. So almost, I'm not sure the actual numbers, but dozens of cities around the country did this live broadcast of this boxing match, including here in Seattle, in that summer of 1921. Now, I did a big research project about Christmas Eve broadcasting. This is probably 20 years ago now. Because the very first broadcast of the human voice was on Christmas Eve, 1906. That's the popular theory. There's no proof of it, but there was a Canadian scientist named Reginald Fessenden who was working on Cape Cod. And he, on Christmas Eve, broadcast to ships at sea, who theoretically would have only been hearing dots and dashes of Morse code, and all of a sudden they hear Reginald Fessenden welcoming them. He plays a Christmas record, he plays the violin and sings, and he says, tune in again next week, for on New Year's Eve for another broadcast. He may not have used the word broadcast. But in that single original broadcast, he pretty much did everything that radio would ever do, short of, sports, right? He had music, he did a promo, he sang. But if you go throughout history, Christmas Eve ends up being this night of all sorts of radio firsts that happen in almost every era of radio. It's when the Metropolitan Opera debuts in the 1930s. It's when all sorts of crazy things happen with radio firsts. So in doing this, I read about some Seattle guys singing on the radio on Christmas Eve 1921, including a guy named Tom Sandry. I know Tom Sandry. It can't be the same Tom Sandry. The gentleman pictured is Tom Sandry, who was a museum volunteer for many years. After I saw what I knew was his father's name in the newspaper about singing on the radio in 1921 on the roof of the old Frederick Nelson building, I called Tom and he said, oh yeah, that was my dad. He was in a choir. They used to sing on all the time. And I went with him and saw him sing on the radio, and I dropped the phone. So I thought maybe Tom had gone to that Christmas Eve broadcast in 1921, but it turned out he'd actually gone to an earlier broadcast in the summer of 1921. So I sat down with Tom in his living room. This is probably 2003. He is since deceased. And he told me the story of visiting and witnessing one of the very first broadcasts in Seattle radio history.
The year was 1921, I think sometime during the summer. And my father invited, I should say escorted, my sister and me to the roof of the old PI building, which is located on the northeast corner of 6th and Pine Street, across from Frederick and Nelson, as I recall. We got in an elevator and rode up I think the building was 3 stories high or something like that. And he took us into a penthouse, a little structure, square structure, in the middle of the roof of the old PI building. This was we were taken up there to listen to my father and 3 other men and a pianist singing into the newfangled radiophone. I don't know the power, but at any rate, it consisted of numerous pieces of equipment that we found very mysterious. Glowing tubes, for instance, big ones, along one wall, on one end of this little box of a room. And the engineer was fiddling with dials, and these things were popping and cracking, and finally they settled down. And in the middle of the room was a giant megaphone hanging from the ceiling. Its small end fed into what we later knew as a microphone. And these men sang into the large end of the megaphone. And that's the way, I presume, because the megaphone was probably required all the help it could get, I would imagine. these guys sort of leaned into this big, huge megaphone and sang their songs. I can't remember the songs they sang. My mind was so taken with all I was seeing that I was only halfway listening, I expect. But anyway, we felt very honored to be with my father at this broadcast.
I like the way Tom apologizes for not remembering songs that he heard when he was 6 years old. And the image he describes of the man like leaning into the giant megaphone, reverse megaphone, he paints a wonderful picture there. And the fact that he witnessed one of the very first broadcasts was just was such an honor to hear that story from Tom. And I hear myself laughing in the background when he talks about the tubes cracking and popping and everything. Just a really cool guy. He was born in 1915. His parents met at the Alaska Yukon Pacific Exposition in 1909. And he lived in a house on 5th Avenue, right along where Interstate 5 is now. He used to talk about watching them build Roosevelt High School. And he worked in the Todd shipyards during World War II, and he was a total radio nut. He would quote things to me and repeat jingles and stuff. We would talk for hours about old Seattle radio back in the old days. I think he passed away that's been more than 10 years ago now. All right, so 1921 is when that's when it really begins. That's when sort of radio's a thing. People are tuning in. The newspapers are covering lots of radio happenings and writing about it in very purple prose. I think this radio carol that says, sounding through the air like the voices of the angels that sang at the birth of Christ in Bethlehem. That's pretty high praise. That really kind of sets the expectation for the listener. This is going to be some really good music coming through that tiny little speaker, and or maybe only through the headphones. All right, next slide, please. So things quickly moved from this sort of amateur experimental phase into a much more commercial phase. And one of the leaders in this is a station that recently changed its name to KNWN, which broke so many hearts around here. KOMO, which was a station owned by the Fisher family, they spared no expense. I've never seen their books or how much money they were burning through in the 1920s when radio was this. Certainly wasn't generating the kind of revenue that it would generate a decade or so later. But they had full-time orchestra. They spared no expense in having original artwork created to decorate their booklets and things they used to attract advertisers. And they really sort of figured out a way of almost doing a kind of underwriting where they would get a local business would pay them a certain amount of money and they would get a certain number of announcements during a part of the day. It was way ahead of its time. And it's a story that hasn't been told very often because, in general, West Coast radio history, as popular as radio was here, has really been ignored by the academics over the decades for whatever reason. Next slide, please. Just the number of engineers that KOMO had working for them, probably more than the typical full staff of any of the smaller stations in Seattle. It really was a first-class operation. And they aligned with the National Broadcasting Company in 1926 and carried programs from New York and from Chicago, which they were able to get by about 1929 or 1930. The technology came into play that let programs produced on the East Coast or the Midwest be sent live to the West Coast by wire and then sent out to the listening public by antenna. So for the first decade, the 1920s, radio producers and broadcasters here are pretty much on their own. They can play recordings from elsewhere. They can get a disc of something that's been produced in advance. But there's no network to tap into until about 1929 or 1930. And those years aren't very well documented in terms of the programming. You look at the old program schedules and see what they were airing, but we don't know very much about some of the people who were putting the programs on. I would love to know more about just how you fill the dead air during the day. Next slide, please. One great way to fill dead air, or one way just to fill air in general, is by doing remote broadcasting, or what they call live pickups. Jim Wilkie in the audience can speak to the power of this. You were doing this in the 1960s at the Penthouse for King Radio. This is Fisher Blend Station, KOMO's live remote truck. And they would often they'd have a set schedule where they'd say Tuesday night at 8, they would be at the Butler Hotel, and they'd do 2 hours of dance music, which meant paying the cost to the phone company to use the line that connects the hotel to the radio station, and probably having an announcer there to sort of make announcements maybe between songs or maybe every 15 or 20 minutes or so. But other than that, you didn't have to make any effort to fill those hours of airtime. And it was enough of a novelty that people would tune in and hear 2 hours of dance music from the Butler Hotel every Tuesday night at 8, just because it was such a new thing to do. Next slide, please. It's a very complicated story, which we won't get into super detail on tonight, but KOMO and KJR, which had been started by Vincent Kraft, our own version of Marconi here. Kraft had sold KJR to a guy named Adolf Linden. Adolf Linden had tried to start a national radio network from Seattle in 1927. Anyone want to take a guess what day of the year they chose to debut that first national radio network from Seattle?
Christmas.
Very good. Glad you're paying attention. And that was called the American Broadcasting Company, or ABC. No relation to the ABC that's currently in business today. Adolf Linden eventually went to prison. It's always funny when radio station owners go to prison. There was some kind of financial shenanigans and the American Broadcasting Company ceased operation. But they did have that very wonderful Christmas debut. Long story short, KJR ended up in receivership or bankrupt. The people at NBC back east reached out to the Fishers, who owned KOMO, and said, why don't you guys take over KJR and you can broadcast one of our NBC networks on KOMO and our other NBC network on KJR. NBC had what they called a red network and a blue network, so 2 channels of programming. Red was the more prestigious station, where they had the station shows that were sponsored and the shows with big stars and recognizable names. Blue was more sort of public affairs programming, lectures, choirs, things like someone like me up there. I'd probably be on the Blue Network now if I was doing the show tonight on the radio. And so they had this wonderful glory years in the 1930s. And they had a gorgeous studio on top of the Skinner Building, where the Fifth Avenue Theater is. Huge soundstage where they did radio plays and orchestral performances. Anyone famous who came to town would go and do an interview on KOMO or KJR. And it was just, it epitomizes the golden era of radio nationally and locally with this wonderful showplace they had in the Skinner Building throughout the 1920s. Now, before we go to the next slide, let's go to the next slide. Now, one of the things that, because radio history is so, what's the word? It's so ephemeral, right? It's just, especially before there were tape recorders or easy ways to record things, the programming would just go out into the air, people would hear it, and then it would be gone forever. And so there's very little that exists, very few recordings that exist of any of the earliest days of radio. And in fact, it's not until 1929, January 1929, where the very first surviving recording of a radio program that originated from anywhere in Washington was made. And the only reason it exists is because the Great Northern dedicated their tunnel through the Cascades up at Stevens Pass. This was, they built a tunnel there in the 1890s, but this was the big, new, and improved tunnel, which is still in operation to this day. I think it's 8 miles long. Eliminates a bunch of switchbacks, eliminates something like 30 minutes from the travel time through the mountains. Big deal. They've been digging it for years, and then it had this big grand opening. And so the railroad sponsored a big national broadcast on NBC. Graham McNamee was the announcer, one of the best known announcers of sports, news, you name it. The guys did everything in those days. And they had him out there at the tunnel to ride the train through the tunnel and provide details about what he'd seen and heard at both ends. And because Great Northern had, deep pockets, they paid to have special presentations of recordings of this event. They recorded the whole thing, number one. Then they presented these big booklets, like big albums of discs to the investors or VIPs and things. And so that's the only reason this one program from 1929 exists. And we're going to hear a little sample here in a second, but listen for the sound of the train. It's very unusual to have this sort of outdoor ambient sound in a radio broadcast from 1929. So much of what was on the radio in those days was either band music live from a hotel or someone reading a carefully prepared script. In this instance, we hear Graham McNamee improvising, and we hear a natural sound effect that, in my mind, takes me back to 1929 far better than any newsreel or any photograph could. So let's hear Graham McNamee up there in Stevens Pass. Oops.
Ladies and gentlemen,
Oriental limits of the Great Northern will be with us in a very few moments, and we'll be ready to start on this real great trip, the first train to go through the new Cascade Tunnel. This train tonight carries 25 coaches. I think that is somewhat, there's the train, did you hear the whistle? There it is. And that is the Oriental Limited. We get an awful kick out of it right here. I don't know just how it sounds down below or wherever you may be. Wherever you may be is probably below us or because of our elevation. Now I believe we're going in a moment. I'll have to hop this train. In the meantime, we return you to our studios in New York City.
I like how at first he tries to compete with the train whistle, and then he realizes, I can't compete with the train whistle, and he sort of gives up for a few seconds, then he gets back into competing with it.
It's live radio.
And I know, and that's the magic right there. That's exactly, yeah, and just the improvisation. Now, he gets into the coach, and it's supposed to be about a 10-minute ride through the tunnel. It was 8 miles, something like that. But there was some kind of air pressure problem inside the tunnel. This was not the first time they were using it, but the first time they were dedicating it like this. And so what was supposed to be about an 10-minute journey ended up taking like 25 minutes. And so on the recording, they sort of inexplicably go back to the studio and they just play, I don't think it's a live band, but they play novelty songs like that one about I Fall Down and Go Boom. It's just they're basically filling the dead air time, you know, as the challenge of any radio station or any radio program, national or local. But that ambient sound like that sets this recording apart in so many ways. Really, if you close your eyes, it's like, I don't know, the whole thing about, you know, the best radio has the best pictures because it's in your own mind, I completely subscribe to. All right, so the 20s, we get into the 30s, and radio around the United States becomes a staple of entertainment, a staple of news for people who are, you know, out of work because of the Depression. Skillful politicians like Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who knows how to address an audience, knows how to talk to the radio, knows that in talking to the microphone, he's talking to just one person. He's not talking to a crowded auditorium of 10,000 people. It's this intimate thing, and FDR gets that better than anybody, certainly better than Herbert Hoover. And the networks double down and produce more entertainment programming and more news programming. They don't have the news that we come to associate with radio a little bit later on yet. That comes later in the late 1930s. But, next slide, please. They do have news by 1938, when you have the Munich Crisis of September 1938. This is when the Nazis annexed part of Czechoslovakia, and it looks like the world, Europe is teetering on the brink of war. The Prime Minister of England, Neville Chamberlain, flies back and forth between London and Munich, trying to negotiate some kind of a settlement or some way. And the radio networks cover it unlike anything they've ever covered before. They had covered the Lindbergh trial earlier in the decade, but it wasn't the same kind of immediacy, and there wasn't the threat that World War II or imminent war in Europe meant in terms of people paying attention. They were interrupting the program so much with bulletins. The joke was, we interrupt this bulletin to bring you a program. And so the public got used to hearing breaking news on their radios all throughout September of 1938. That year was also when Orson Welles and the Mercury Theater had been given an hour on Sunday nights on CBS, kind of the equivalent of NBC Blue. So there's no sponsor, it was just an hour to do whatever they wanted to do. And so they started producing hour-long radio plays based on like works that were in the public domain, where there was no fee to adapt or work. They did Dracula in July of 1938, and I've listened to it several times, it's almost incomprehensible. It's really, they hadn't quite got down the narrative skill yet. But by the time October of 1938 rolls around, somebody has the brilliant idea. It could have been Orson Welles, it might have been Howard Koch who wrote the script, it might have been John Houseman. Somebody in Orson Welles' organization says, why don't we do something with War of the Worlds, but instead of just doing a dramatization, let's make it like it's a news broadcast and sort of, kind of, since everyone's been paying attention to the radio during the Munich Crisis, let's have a little fun. No one will believe us. And so the War of the Worlds is broadcast live on the radio. It's 8 o'clock Eastern Time, which means 5 o'clock Pacific Time. And next slide, please. I said before that people really love their radios on the West Coast. And if people tune in their radios on the West Coast and they hear the announcer saying that the Martians have landed, people here believe that. And there was one particular incident up in Skagit County, up in Concrete, on Highway 20 there, where people took War of the Worlds very seriously. Part of it, there's several reasons. Part of it is right at the moment where the announcer says that not only are there alien cylinders landing in New Jersey, they're now landing in other parts of the country as well. Just prior to that, a thunderstorm had been working its way through the Skagit Valley, and the power went out in Concrete, just as that announcement was made. Let's hear this audio file here, please.
A bulletin is handed me. Martian cylinders are falling all over the country. One outside of Buffalo, one in Chicago, St. Louis. Seem to be time and space.
Now, about 20 years ago, I spent the day on the phone trying to find someone in Concrete who might have remembered the War of the Worlds and the effect it had on the town. I called the library, I called the senior center, I called, 8 or 9 places, and finally somebody said, oh yeah, Albert Frank over at the grocery store. He's been around that long, he's still pretty sharp. And it turns out Albert Frank witnessed this panic in the town of Concrete. Let's hear the lower audio cut there, please.
We were coming home from Everett. We hit into Concrete about the time that lightning and thunderstorm hit. And people were kind of wandering around and yelling and screaming, couldn't figure out what was going on. Here comes this woman out of the house there yelling, but the world was coming to an end. We tried to stop her and grab her, and finally we got her into the easel. And she was yelling and screaming there.
So what had happened was when the power went out, a lot of people tuned into the show actually believed that the aliens were on their way, because the beauty of radio compared to television, radio can be in the background. You don't have to sit and you don't have to sit and stare at the radio. You could be doing other things like washing the dishes or doing the laundry or whatever. And the whole War of the Worlds incidents kind of created the whole notion of audience research in a lot of ways. People at Princeton University studied it for decades. They figured something like 6 million people were tuned into the show that night. And of those 6 million, about 1 million actually believed it, at least for some point. But the stories of people panicking and sticking their heads in the oven or running into the hills with rifles and things, most of those were debunked in other parts of the country. They tracked down people who had made these claims, and these interviewers at Princeton, these people said no, they were exaggerating. Not in Concrete. It really happened in Concrete. People really did run like crazy through the streets. And that witness, Albert Frank, told me the whole story. So we love our radios here. And you tell us the aliens are coming, we're going to believe you. So, all right, next slide, please. Now, even scarier than aliens, imaginary aliens, is the actual prospect of war. And radio really came of age. It's kind of a cliche to say that radio news came of age during World War II. And we know this mainly because of some things that happened here in the Northwest. Now, I want to start by just playing some of what I think is the most frightening audio. It still gives me chills every time I hear it. I have it in 3 chunks kind of broken up, and we'll hear it in one after the other. This is recorded on December 8th, 1941, so the day after the Pearl Harbor attack. That's the night where there's going to be a coastal blackout from the Canadian border to the Mexican border. At 11 o'clock, all the lights have to go out along the coast. And all the radio stations go off the air, which is, it's terrifying just to think about that, because of course there's no smartphones, there's no television, there's no other way to get information about what's going on. All you know on the night of December 8th, 1941, if you're in Seattle, is that yesterday, the territory of Hawaii was attacked. It's pretty bad. You don't know the details, but the president that morning said, loss of life has been, there's great loss of life and great damage. For all you know, there could be aircraft carriers off the coast of Washington waiting to send in aerial attacks. So at 7 o'clock that night, on Monday, December 8th, 1941, the radio stations all go off the air. And this is what we hear on my station, KIRO, right before they go off the air. Let's hear the first cut there, please. First speaker.
In the first place, there will be no radio broadcasting tonight after 7 o'clock, except perhaps for one of the Seattle stations, which will probably be KIRO. Leave your dial tuned to KIRO and you'll get the information that is necessary. There will be no programs broadcast, but any information necessary for the civilian populace will be broadcast over KIRO probably.
The timing was great because we had just built this brand new transmitter out on Vashon Island, and we were the only 50,000 watt station, I think, north of San Francisco and west of Denver. So we were at night, the signal carried to Alaska and all over British Columbia and down into California even. So the timing was good. We went live with that power in July of 41. Okay, let's hear the next part of this creepy cut here.
There will be a complete blackout tonight at 11 o'clock. That blackout is not only for the city of Seattle, it includes every light between the California border, or rather the Mexican border, and the Canadian border. That is in the states of Oregon, Washington, and California. Every farmhouse, every light of any kind in that area must be out by 11 o'clock.
Let's hear the next one too, please.
And now by authority of the Federal Communications Commission, KIRO transmits on a frequency of 710 kilocycles with its new power of 50,000 watts. It's almost 7 o'clock, 5 seconds to go, and we'll be back, ladies and gentlemen, with information when ordered by the United States Army Interceptor Command here in Seattle.
Radio silence.
Silence, and I just find that terrifying. I mean, it's so easy to know how it turns out, to know what happened in 1944, 1945, and know just how World War II. That if you studied history now, you sort of know the timeline by heart. But to not know what was going to happen in the next couple of minutes, let alone the next few hours or weeks, boy, there's nothing like that. I've never watched a documentary or looked at a photograph that brings home the civilian feelings around World War II, other than that audio clip. Next slide, please. Now, the only reason that exists, that recording, and why much of the recordings, if not all the recordings of Edward R. Murrow, famous broadcaster who grew up in Skagit County, the only reason they'll exist is because of KIRO. And it wasn't out of some sort of benevolence or magnanimity. It was probably to make money. We were a CBS affiliate even then, and CBS's popular news program was at 5 o'clock every day Eastern Time. That's 2 o'clock Pacific Time. The audience, the potential audience at 2 o'clock Pacific Time just wasn't enough to justify selling advertising. A huge, important news program of the day with all the developments of the war. Started doing, KIRO was recording everything that CBS sent over the network. All the news programs they started recording on these big 16-inch transcription discs, one-time use. You only use them once, right? You record one side, record the other side. They're about 15 minutes per disc. So if you have an hour-long program, that's 2 discs, right? 4 sides. So they would record the world today, the 5 p.m. Eastern Time news broadcast, and then play it at a more reasonable Pacific time in the evening so that the bigger audience could listen from home. When they were done with each day's program, they didn't just throw it away, or they stacked it up out of the transmitter. That beautiful transmitter site out on Vashon became a storage facility. And those discs just sat there, thousands of them. I think something like close to maybe more than 4,000 of these discs. And it wasn't until the 1950s, there was a professor at the University of Washington named Milo Ryan. He was teaching a communications class about propaganda speeches and wanted to share some Winston Churchill recordings and some other recordings with his class. He knew that Saul Hass, the owner of the radio station, might have some access to some recordings like that. And he called up and Saul said, yeah, come on over to the transmitter and see what you can find. So Milo Ryan figured out pretty quickly this was this incredible, priceless trove. Nobody had recorded anything like that to the degree that the station here in Seattle had recorded, and nobody had saved anything. I mean, the network had recorded some things. NBC had recorded a few things, but nowhere was there as comprehensive an archive of World War II news than there was right here on Vashon Island. So Milo Ryan got money from the CBS Foundation, from William Paley, and he transferred all those discs to the current technology of 1960, reel-to-reel tape, and made those tapes available to the public. You could go to the university and you could play those tapes and listen to them. CBS made commercial versions available with a few highlights and things like that. Let's listen to the one closest to me, please.
This is Trafalgar Square. The noise that you hear at the moment is the sound of the air raid siren. I'm standing here just on the steps of St. Martin's in the Field. A searchlight just burst into action off in the distance. One single beam sweeping the sky above me now. People are walking along quite quietly. We're just at the entrance of an air raid shelter here, and I must move this cable over just a bit so people can walk in. I can see just straight away in front of me Lord Nelson on top of that big column. There's another searchlight just square behind Nelson's statue. I'll just let you listen to the traffic and the sound of the siren for a moment. Just a few people here walking rather.
And that's Edward R. Murrow, who grew up in Skagit County, broadcasting for CBS, live from Trafalgar Square. You hear the sirens in the background, you hear the footsteps. My mother grew up in London. I used to play that for her and it would make her cry. Or would re-traumatize her, having survived the Blitz herself. But none of that would exist had KIRO not just made the decision to buck the network rule about not recording anything. They weren't supposed to record things. And then playing at a later time and stacking it up out of Vashon. Now, let's see here. Let's skip ahead. Skip 2 slides, please. Okay. One last little bit about West Coast radio, and then I'll open up for if there's any questions. The time zone thing has usually been a disadvantage because all the national programs were 8 p.m., 9 p.m. Eastern Time, 5 p.m., 6 p.m. Pacific Time. That changed a little bit in the 1940s when they would do 2 versions of a particular radio drama. They'd do a version live for the East Coast at 8 o'clock Eastern Time, and then another version live for the West Coast at 8 o'clock. So the advantage, disadvantage kind of evened out by the time you get to the mid-1940s. But you couldn't do that with news. And on the night of D-Day, the night before D-Day, that same night my dad's in the woods in Poland tuning in, fiddling with that German radio, the first news of the Allied invasion of Europe, which is the biggest news people have been waiting for a year. They know that once the Allies pick somewhere and land on the continent of Europe, it's near the end of the Nazis. The Allies will go ashore in Europe and wipe out the Nazis and kick the Nazis out of France, all that stuff. So it's the biggest news everybody's waiting for. The radio networks all prepare together. They do kind of pool reporting. They do months and months of preparation to be able to cover everything thoroughly and not give away information and not prejudice anything. So the first news that something is happening, there's some sort of a report is picked up on the German radio. And one of the news bureaus in the United States says this in a news broadcast. It's about 12:37 a.m. on the East Coast. So it's after midnight. Most people on the East Coast are still asleep. On the West Coast, it's not even 10 o'clock yet. It's prime time. People are tuned into their radios, and they hear this. And Time Magazine wrote about this, but pretty much the entire West Coast and some of the mountain time zones stayed up and listened to the D-Day coverage. Because once the news was out, the networks swung into action with all these plans they'd made to have all these correspondents. In England, correspondents who went ashore with some of the landing craft, correspondents who went around the area with an airplane and came back and kind of gave reports. All that stuff happened between, midnight and 3 o'clock Pacific time, or 3 o'clock, 6 o'clock Eastern time. So the East Coast missed out. The most exciting part of the broadcast was kind of what they call the Gettysburg Address of World War II radio, when they give the official word that the invasion is underway. It's such a short announcement, the announcer reads it twice. Let's hear that really quickly right here.
The text of communique number 1 will be released to the press and radio of the United Nations in 10 seconds. Repeat, 10 seconds from now. Under the command of General Eisenhower, Allied naval forces, supported by strong air forces, began landing Allied armies this morning on the northern coast of France. The communique will be repeated. Under the command of General Eisenhower, Allied naval forces, supported by strong air forces, began landing Allied armies this morning on the northern coast of France.
And so that was the biggest news since Pearl Harbor, that the invasion was underway, and most of the country missed it. But here on the West Coast, anecdotal evidence suggests that people stayed up late, lights were on in houses, electricity consumption was higher than normal because people they knew this was important and they tuned in. Even Bob Hope, he summed it up perfectly the next day on a kind of truncated version of his program where he'd go around doing concerts from military bases. Let's hear Bob Hope explaining the West Coast experience of D-Day.
What happened during these last few hours, not one of us will ever forget. How could you forget? We sat up all night by the radio and heard the postings, the flashes, the voices coming across from England, the commentators, the pilots returning from their greatest of all missions, newsboys yelling on the street, and it seemed that one world was ending and a new world beginning. That history was closing one book and opening a new one. And somehow we knew it had to be a better one. We sat there and the dawn began to sneak in and we saw the hundreds of thousands of kids you'd seen in camp the past 2 or 3 years. The kids who scream and whistle when they hear a gag in a song. And now you could see all of them again in 4,000 ships on the English Channel, tumbling out thousands of planes over Normandy and the occupied coast. And countless landing barges crashing the Nazi gates, going on through to do the job that's the job of all. The sun came up and you sat there looking at that huge black headline. That one great black word with the exclamation point, invasion.
Anyway, I always thought it was cool that Bob Hope summed it up so well because he had the West Coast experience living there in California. Anyone have any questions or comments here? We're reaching the end of the show here. All right, I got one last slide. Let's go to the very last slide, please. One where it says Tom Sandry. Oops.
Is that a call?
Oops. I mentioned Tom was a radio nut. He knew by heart the old sign-off from KOMO from the early 1930s, and he recited it for me when I interviewed him.
I remember hearing KOMO signing off, and I remember their words. They said, and now our day is done. If we have pleased by entertaining and instructing, we are glad. And may the good God above guard and keep you through the night. We will greet you again at 7 o'clock. This is KOMO, Fisher's Blend Station, Incorporated. We operate under the authorization of the Federal Radio Commission on a frequency of 960 kilocycles. Good night.
Thank you very much. Oh, Jim, go
I,
ahead.
I grew up in Iowa. There was a radio station in Iowa that had a very diligent sales force. They were very skilled at selling advertising. They sold their sign-off announcement. It was sponsored sign-off announcement.
That's brilliant.
The following 6 hours of golden silence is brought to you by Hohenschue Mortuary.
If any radio sales executives are listening tonight or tuned in, they might have a new idea to reach out to some clients.
Because no one signs off anymore.
That's true. Yeah. Any other questions or comments? Everybody loves radio? Raise your hand. You wouldn't be here if you didn't love radio. Okay, good. I'm glad there are still people who love radio. Thanks for everybody tuning in via Facebook too. And thanks to MOHAI. Thanks everybody for hosting me. And tune in to the radio. Oh, Jennifer.
I have a question. So I was curious, when you showed the investments that Fisher made into sort of the embellishments of there, did it take a lot of capital to start a radio station, or was that just a special case that like they had the capital so they invested in it?
It's kind of a special case. I mean, there's one of the legends of radio in Seattle is that there was a guy named Louis Wasmer, and he had a radio station in Wenatchee. I might have this backwards, but when he was disgruntled, he packed up the transmitter into the sidecar of his motorcycle and drove it to Seattle. So you could do it with a very limited amount of capital if you had a transmitter and you had someplace to use it. But what Fisher was trying to do was, I mean, they were taking money from their scone and flour and other businesses and investing that in what they saw as some kind of, they saw it as a public service too. I don't think it was a cynical thing. I think they truly saw it as a way of, enlightening the community.
Corporate image.
What's that?
Corporate image as well.
Yeah, and just doing something for the community
Yeah.
that wasn't being done yet. And I mean, lots of classical music and things that were making people, improving people's minds and stuff like that. The selling came a little bit later. The toothpaste turned in. And very different models of radio. In the UK with the BBC, there's no advertising at all. You paid an annual licensing fee. But the American system sort of produced more material of differing quality than the BBC, and it's just a different animal. So, Jim.
I spent a morning last week listening to the BBC Third program. It's amazing that today, if you don't find something you like on your local radio stations, you can listen to the BBC, you can listen to RAI, the Italian radio, you can listen to RFI, the French radio. It's great. There's lots of wonderful programming out there that is real radio, but we're out of range of their transmitters, but we get it on the internet.
Yeah.
But check out the BBC Third program. There was just some fabulous programming I listened to.
Yeah, and I love the BBC. I listen to the BBC World Service a lot, but I still just love local programming where it's live. The people that you're listening to live here and have to deal with the same realities, whether it's political or climate or whatever. And it's the same light in the sky, the same temperature. There's something that sort of
The connection.
The companionship for me, it's really important that it's local, I guess. I don't know. But yeah, I do listen to BBC. Listen to BBC a lot during the pandemic. They did a lot of great talk radio. Hearing a lot of, they'd have old people calling from London suburbs. Reminding me of my mother, just these old British ladies calling in and complaining about the subway being, not running properly or something. So, you had a question here, sir?
Yeah, I always thought that radio should have a radio guide, like there used to be TV guides. There probably still are TV guides, but
Yeah.
because there's so many programs on the radio, but it's just random whether you can find them or not, isn't it?
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, the websites for different radio stations really vary in the detail that they have about their programming.
Before there was TV, did they have radio guides?
There were
Oh yeah. In the early days, in the 20s and 30s, the newspapers had just lavish coverage of radio, and then it all stopped. Because the newspapers saw the radio as a threat. Once radio was selling advertising, it's like, wait a minute, we can't be promoting these people. Although some radio stations were owned by newspapers, like that station where Tom went and witnessed his dad singing. That was a partnership between the Post-Intelligencer and a couple other entities. I'm not quite clear who those other entities were, but the newspapers and radios battled it out because and there's actually a very famous Supreme Court case out of Bellingham where the radio station there sued to have access to the AP and UPI, access to news and information that only newspapers had a monopoly on. So, and that was settled because of the actions of a station owner up in Bellingham. So, anyway, it's radio's a very personal thing because you can just it's only in your head. Only you see what's in your head. As silly as that sounds, it still has that. And that so much about radio in the car when I was a kid was about Pat O'Day or like Gary Lockwood on KJR or people on King AM, where I knew that if I was listening to KJR at 8 o'clock on a Thursday night, my friends were listening too. And it was like an early form of social media. It's like we knew we were all tuned in or all connected to the same thing. We weren't commenting or posting stupid pictures, but we were connected. We knew what was going on in music or sports or whatever because we were all just sort of tuned into this big consciousness thing. So, I don't know. I get too excited about it sometimes. Any other questions? Well, thank you all for coming out and spending time on a beautiful, Wednesday evening alongside Lake Union. So, thank you.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.